Good morning, everybody. This is just another video to give you a quick overview of the new material you'll be covering in your textbook reading this week. Again, this isn't covering the review readings. This will just cover your new reading section in Chapter 21, the Progressive Era, and those are pages 974 through 983. Okay, so your first big heading on 974 is the Progressive Impulse. And during the late 19th century, there was a wide array of reformers across the country that emerged to address many social issues that had resulted from that rapid urban and industrial development of the United States that happened after the Civil War. And it's important to keep in mind that progressives were liberals, not revolutionaries. In the 20th century, liberalism referred to the views held by those who believed that governments must exercise greater power on behalf of society in regulating the behavior of businesses and ensuring the welfare of the people. They wanted to reform and regulate capitalism, not destroy it. Most of them were Christian moralists who felt that politics had become a contest between good and evil. The issues they addressed varied, but what progressives all shared was the assumption that government must become more active in addressing the problems created by this rapid growth. Okay, and the sources of progressivism. That's your next big heading. And these are issues that fueled or were relevant to the progressive movements during this era. And these are the subheadings in your text, and we'll look a little at each of these. Okay, so the economic depression of the 1890s was the biggest factor in igniting the progressive spirit of reform. And this depression brought massive layoffs, and nearly a quarter of the adults in the workforce lost their jobs. So although the United States had the highest per capita income in the world, it also had some of the highest concentrations of poverty. So in 1900, the U.S. population was 82 million, and an estimated 10 million of those people were living in poverty. And the effects of the Depression prompted many upper middle class urban reformers, like lawyers and doctors, teachers, journalists, to organize their efforts to help those in need. And then there was populism. This is another part of progressivism. So the Populist Party platforms, or the People's Party platforms, in 1892 and 1896 included reforms that were intended to give more power to the people, like direct election of U.S. senators. William Jennings Bryan, you might remember him, he ran for president in 1896, and his loss ended the Populist Party as a serious political force. But many reforms that the populists had pushed were picked up by other progressives. Okay, so the honest government, the idea of honest government. Okay, so the mugwumps were gentlemen reformers who had fought the patronage system and insisted that government jobs be awarded on the basis of merit. And they supplied progressivism with another goal, the honest government ideal, right? The idea that government would function without corruption. So over the years, this good government movement expanded to address urban issues like crime, unequal access to resources such as electricity, clean water, mass transit, things like that. So socialism. The Socialist Party of America was supported mostly by militant farmers and German Jewish immigrants, and this served as the radical wing of progressivism. Socialists focused on improving working conditions and closing the widening income gap between the rich and the poor through progressive taxation. So this was where tax rates would rise with income. So the more money you made, the more you would pay in taxes. Most progressives, by contrast, were capitalist reformers, not socialist radicals. So most progressives rejected the extremes of both socialism and the laissez-faire individualism, and they preferred a regulated capitalism that was softened by humanitarianism. And then there was muckraking journalism. So the muckrakers were America's first investigative journalists, and their aggressive reporting played a crucial role in educating readers about political and corporate wrongdoing and revealing the really bad living conditions experienced by immigrants and other poor people. The muckrakers got their nickname from Theodore Roosevelt, who said that crusading journalists were often indispensable to society, but only if they knew when to stop raking the muck. By uncovering political corruption and writing about social ills, muckrakers gave journalism a new political role. Roosevelt frequently used muckrakers to drum up support for his policies. What's considered the golden age of muckraking began in 1902 when Samuel S. McClure, the owner of McClure's magazine, recruited journalists to expose corruption in politics and corporations. McClure claimed that the vitality of democracy depended upon educating the public about complex questions. Significant muckrakers include Lincoln Steffens, Ray Stannard Baker, and Ida Tarbell. They led the way in promoting reforms of all sorts. Steffens focused his investigative reporting on political corruption. Baker concentrated on railroad abuses, and Ida Tarbell, whose father's oil business was destroyed by John D. Rockefeller, focused her energies on revealing the unethical and illegal means by which John D. Rockefeller had built the Standard Oil Trust. Muckraking became the heart of progressivism. Without the muckrakers, progressives would never have achieved widespread popular support. Investigative journalism became such a powerful force for change that one editor said that Americans were benefiting from government by magazine. Religious activism was another element of progressivism directed at achieving social justice, and this was the idea that society had an ethical obligation to help its poorest and most vulnerable members. Rugged individualism, they argued, may have been the path to wealth, but Christian socialism offered hope for unity among all classes. They believed that the solution to economic tensions was social solidarity. In many respects, the progressive movement formed a new phase of Christian spiritual revival. This was a form of public outreach focused not so much on converting people to Christianity as on social reform. The Religious Education Association, which was formed in 1903, explained that the age of sheer individualism is past and the age of social responsibility has arrived. So the social gospel. This is connected to the religious activism and social responsibility idea. And this came about during the last part of the 19th century when churches and synagogues started emphasizing community service to address the needs of the unfortunate. And the social gospel is the belief that religious institutions and individual Christians must help bring about the kingdom of God on earth. There were three important organizations in this movement that began in England and came to the United States. And these were the Young Men's Christian Association, or the YMCA, and a similar group for women, the YWCA. And there were also Hebrew counterparts to these organizations, the YMHA and the YWHA, that served in cities with large Jewish populations. But all of these combined religious evangelism with social services and fitness training community centers. And they were intended to provide low-cost housing and exercise in a safe Christian environment for young men and women from rural areas or foreign countries. And they often included libraries and classrooms and kitchens. And the third organization was the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army centers offered soup kitchens to feed the poor, as well as nurseries for the children of working mothers. So the major forces behind the social gospel movement were Protestants and Catholics who thought that Christianity had become too closely associated with the upper and middle classes. Washington Gladden was a pastor in Springfield, Massachusetts, and he became the first prominent religious leader to support the rights of workers to form unions. In 1875, he published Working People and Their Employers, which argued that true Christianity was based on the principle that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Gladden rejected the social Darwinist view, which said, you'll remember, that the poor and disabled shouldn't be helped because helping them would mess up the survival of the fittest process. Gladden argued instead that helping the poor was an essential element of the Christian faith, and in keeping with that, he also condemned racial segregation and discrimination against immigrants. Gladden's efforts helped launch a new era in which churches engaged with the problems created by this rapidly urbanizing and industrializing society in which they found themselves. He and other social gospelers reached out to the working poor who lived in grossly substandard housing, lacked the legal right to form unions, and had no insurance for on-the-job accidents. Walter Rauschenbusch, a German-born Baptist minister, became the greatest champion of the social gospel. In 1907, he published Christianity and the Social Crisis, in which he argued that whoever uncouples the religious and social life has not understood Jesus. He believed that the Christian emphasis on personal salvation had to be linked with an equally passionate commitment to social justice. In Rauschenbusch's view, religious life needed the social gospel to revitalize it and make it socially relevant. He said, "We shall never have a perfect social life, yet we must seek it with faith." His message resonated with Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and many others, and years later, Martin Luther King Jr. said that Christianity and the social crisis, quote, "left an indelible imprint on my thinking." Also significant in the social gospel movement were innovative community centers called settlement houses. And Hull House was one of these. It was a brick mansion that was converted into a settlement house in Chicago. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, both college-educated women from privileged backgrounds, in an effort to express the spirit of Christ, as they said, organized a progressive reform community at Hull House to address the needs of the unskilled working poor, especially newly arrived European immigrants. At Hull House, all residents were treated as equals, and the Hull House served 50,000 working poor in its first year, and by 1940, that number had grown to about 320,000 per year. The house provided or sponsored many amenities such as a nursery for working mothers, health clinics, lectures, men's clubs, an employment bureau, gymnasium, a savings bank, as well as offered classes in all sorts of discipline like acting, weaving, history, philosophy, and music. By the early 20th century, there were hundreds of settlement houses in cities across the United States. Adams and other settlement house leaders soon realized that political reform was going to be a necessary part of their agendas, and they began lobbying for city parks and playgrounds, neighborhood cleanup days, and laws and regulations to improve living conditions in poor neighborhoods. Jane Addams became influential in Chicago, serving on governmental and community boards and focusing on improving public health and food safety, among many other things, and she went on to become the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Another woman active with the work of Hull House was Florence Kelley. She was a graduate of Cornell University and Northwestern University School of Law, and her book, Hull House Maps and Papers, contained her research documenting the exploitation of poor women and children, along with essays written by social scientists. And this book inspired new city ordinances and workplace regulations. Then the last section is the women's suffrage movement. So from 1890 to 1910, the number of employed women tripled from 2.6 million to 7.8 million. As college-educated women became more involved in the world of work and wages, the suffrage movement grew. In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association in New York City, and its purpose was to promote a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution. But in addition to this, they also campaigned for new laws requiring higher pay for working women and making it easier for abused wives to get divorces. Other suffrage activists thought that pursuing multiple issues like this hurt their chances of achieving voting rights. So Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone formed another organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association. It was based in Boston, and it focused solely on voting rights and included men among its leaders. But in 1890, the two groups united as the National American Woman Suffrage Association. That same year, Wyoming Territory became a state, and it was the first state to give full voting rights to women. The West, you may remember, was the region most supportive of women's rights, and one of the several reasons for this was that the mostly male settlers in the Western Territories hoped that allowing women to vote would encourage more women to settle in the region. And several more Western states embraced women voters between 1890 and 1912. It wasn't until 1917 that New York became the first Eastern state to allow women full voting rights. Many advocates for women's suffrage argued that the right to vote and hold office was just a matter of simple justice. Women, they said, were just as capable as men of exercising the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. Others insisted that women were morally superior to men and would better promote the welfare of society as a whole. And of course, the women's suffrage movement had its share of social, ethnic, and racial prejudices. After the Civil War, when the 15th Amendment was passed, some suffragists believed that women should be granted the vote before freedmen. And at the end of the 19th century, suffragists strongly criticized Congress for allowing illegal immigrant men to vote while not allowing well-educated women to vote. And throughout the country, many suffrage organizations didn't allow African American women to join. Okay, that's where we'll stop. So have a good rest of the day and let me know if you have any questions.